Welcome to the Chess Channel, the channel where you can learn loads. To date, we have covered 15 games, 15 very different games from across the spectrum. If I'm not mistaken, we covered 2 different Bobby Fischer games, 2 Wesleysa games, a single Tal game, a Magnus Carlsen game where he blundered his queen, a Leela Stockfish game from the recent Top Chess Engine Championship, and in the last 4 editions, we have looked at games that came from the 2022 Chess Olympiad Games in Chennai. Today's selected game is devoted to this chap. Bobby Fischer is the biggest chess success in the United States, and since he appeared on the scene, no one was able to overshadow him. Many people call Paul Morphy the pride and sorrow of chess, but I think Bobby Fischer is the real pride and sorrow of chess. Bobby Fischer's story is a way more complex one, to say the least. Not only he made each game look so easy, but who would ever imagine Bobby Fischer to make a disappearing act, and withdraw in the shadows like a ghost? When he returned to the public eye, he went on to say he hated chess, and stunned the entire world with some of his comments. Though very little was known whilst he was in hiding, very little is also known about what he did when it came to the game. In 2001, Nigel Short went public claiming he played against Bobby Fischer on an online chess platform, but later on, he retracted when he assumed his rival may not have been Bobby Fischer himself. There are numerous theories put forward as to whether Nigel Short really played against Bobby Fischer. Some people believe it was Fischer and others do not. Since no one has come forwards to claim who actually played Nigel Short, we might just treat this encounter as a genuine one in inverted commas. Those who have investigated further to unearth the truth about the Short-Fischer encounter have not been able to establish with any degree of certainty whether Nigel was playing Fischer or whether he was up against someone who was pretending to be Bobby. 8 games and all were played with Nigel Short losing all 8 of them, but does this imply his online opponent was Bobby Fischer? And this is where the divide is. Some people would always claim Nigel was up against someone who was not Bobby Fischer, and others would say it had to be Fischer. Whether it was Fischer or not, these games are on record and we shall be looking at least one. Before we do this, let's examine the possibility that Nigel's opponent was not Bobby Fischer but Mr. or Mrs. X. Because of the very weird nature of how the games turned out to be, some suggested the person was being aided by a computer. How true can this statement be? Computers back in 2001 were in their infancy stage. We had the likes of Fritz, Chessmaster, Chess Tiger, and many other engines, but they were not as strong as our human grandmasters were. We also know in 1996, Garry Kasparov went on to defeat Deep Blue, but came 1997, and Garry Kasparov could no longer keep up. They say a picture speaks 1,000 words, and this is one picture that does just that. Computers back in 1997 were simply unable to stand up to our best grandmasters, but how come Deep Blue was able to beat Garry Kasparov? Though this is something we can look at in another video, a short answer that we can provide is that Deep Blue was no ordinary computer. With the ability to compute 200 million positions per second, twice as fast as the 1996 version, it was not a question of if but when Deep Blue would beat our best human players. With no one having access to such a supercomputer but its makers, and with the games Short played being 5 minutes long each, the assumption that anyone used a computer against him would not be a valid assumption. Why not? Well, try this yourself. Take 5 minutes, set everything up and try to play the game. In addition to this being a near impossible task to accomplish, there was no computer back in 2001 able to play these moves we saw in this game. We know some people said, if this was not Fischer, it was a person who had access to some computer. If this were the case, do we know of any computer that would behave in the way we shall see when we get to see how this game unfolds? And just before we get started, a warning on what you are about to see. You would have seen it already in the thumbnail, but whatever these games have to offer, the benefit they provide is that they have entirely changed the way this game is now being played. In short, this is where the Bongcloud Chess Opening theory has emerged, and we do get to see it so often today. The game we have chosen to cover is basically not very different as to how the other 7 games are. The openings follow a very similar pattern, giving chess an entirely new meaning. Though millions of people watch these games on the web, getting hold of these 8 PGNs is not easy. Besides this point, these 8 games have been magnificent because they are highly educational and there is plenty to learn from. So let's cast aside the fact whether this was Fischer or not and focus attention on what is to follow. Nigel Short assumed this side of the board and started things up with 1 e4. Fischer opened up with the French, and right after this push to the center, this is where the Bongcloud stuff kicks in. This is what Fischer does. It's for sure a shocking revelation, but was it meant to raise Nigel's eyebrows? How on earth do you deal with such a king move, and how can you make the most out of this huge inaccuracy? Nigel developed the knight. Fischer pulls back his king to where he stood earlier. And what this means is that not only he loses a tempo, but most importantly, this king has no longer the ability to castle. Nigel here went on to develop his other knight. And if king e7 and king e8 were in one word pointless, Fischer picks up his king and places him on e7 again. What this means is that he is allowing Nigel to gain a few tempi and at the same time is challenging him to find a way to get to him. Nigel opted for development number 3. He went for this bishop move, and what Fischer does here is to really muddy the waters as much as he can. This is what he does. It's the first time in the history of the game we do get to see this king repeat moves. If you observe the chessboard, Nigel has 2 pawns occupying the center, he has the knight pair holding key outposts, and in addition, he has a bishop on c4. Fischer has just a single pawn development, and this could not be good. With Short castling here, Fischer in turn develops this pawn, and Short has basically enough with this position and decides to break things wide open. He went for this attack. Fischer too responds in this way. And with the bishop backing off to safety, Fischer gets his first major piece to come into the game. This is what he does. It's not something you get to see every day, but for sure this position can't be looking good for black. Fischer in his day was extremely inventive. Do not forget, he is the one who invented chess 960, and he is the one who was coming up with new concepts. Short feels he has something going on here, and at the same time he knows, this is all a matter of time. If you break through via this move, there is a trick you can try and apply. If the pawn is removed, go on to hand over the knight, and as soon as the knight is captured, once you get rid of this pawn with the queen, it would either be this rook coming off next, or you will get nailed on f7. If you chase after the queen in this way, once you hit on f7 with a check, what you are also looking at is a mate in 1. Right after this king move, the only thing you need to do is to eliminate the bishop, and because this check does not allow the king to go anywhere, this is what you call a first-class checkmate. If you alternatively go on to attack the queen with the knight, Short would have a choice between taking the rook or taking on f7 with a check. Which is the best option to exercise, and why? Taking the rook is tempting when it comes to choosing between him and a pawn. If you take him, once you discover this type of initiative, does this imply the queen is trapped? It's a close call, but if you are able to find the right sequence of moves, you may be okay. How do you prevent bishop b7, and how do you stop the queen from being captured? This is the move you are looking for. Should you now attack the queen? This is your way out. And should you now try this attack on the bishop? Then you would have blown it. Take first with a check, and once the king moves to this square, just go on to get rid of the bishop. The absolute best response you can go for is to take the queen, and when you two take with a check, when the bishop comes off, white would be able to finish off quite easily. Not only there is a pawn of 2 surplus, and not only Nigel would have 2 rooks, but most of the action is here on f7. This pawn is very hard to stop. Rook e1 for example, and rook f8, runs into this instant solution, and with the rook having to go for a single pawn, what you see here is a matter of a handful of moves. Coming back to this position, we looked at e takes d5. What if we removed this pawn using this pawn on c6? I fully apologize because we missed something in our previous variation. We saw what happens if the rook is removed from the corner, but not what happens if the queen gets rid of the pawn on f7 with a check. It's here, and let's come to it. After the queen comes under fire, this is the variation. Take with a check, and with the king forced to d8, this knight move into e7 is right in time to stop the taking of the bishop with a mate. In the meantime, Nigel would have a crushing position, but can you see what he needs to do? This is the move which paralyzes the king and every piece in his vicinity. Bishop b7 to allow the king some leeway is not going to be enough. Bishop g5 works a treat, but there is another move that may be way more effective. What does this knight jump into the fifth do? This has to be the move of the day. There is very little to stop his access into e6. If you allow this fork, the game would be over. If you opt for this king run, you are not looking at this queen check, which certainly works, but again, there is a far more effective move in the making. Can you find it? This is it. If the knight comes off, now you can move in with a check, and because of the opening, as soon as you stick the queen to block the checkmate, all you do is to delay it by one move. Queen d8 and queen takes, and this would be it. If after knight g5 you try this queen move to c6, this move is not going to be enough. Once you deliver this check, it's another classic case of a checkmate unless you hand over the queen. King c8 lands you in with this mate, and wouldn't this be something? We need to return to the actual game to see what happened. There was no e5, but Nigel chose for this avenue of play. Fischer without delay went after this bishop, Nigel backs him off to safety, and now via this push on the queen side, Nigel is fully aware of how this bishop on b3 would hang if he does not react. He delayed this response to something else. He first went on to attack the queen. And with Fischer getting his queen to move to this outpost, Nigel goes on to open up an escape path to the bishop. As soon as Fischer saw a4 on the board, he used the pawn to launch an attack on the knight. What is wicked about this game so far? Besides the opening we experienced, Fischer has gone for only pawn moves, with the exception of this queen being on b6, and of course let's not forget, he moved the king at least 4 times. With this attack on the knight, Nigel backed him off to the second, Fischer in turn develops the knight, and what we can see, this knight is after this central pawn on e4. Nigel went on to remove this pawn on e6, Fischer captures him, and now this is where things get tricky. Do you cover this pawn on e4 or do you leave him as bait? Knight e5 for example would have been a very interesting initiative. If you do go on to get rid of this central pawn, what does queen d3 do, and what does even this knight move into f4 do? Knight f4 for example is bound to lead to the trade of the knight for the bishop, and should you develop your bishop into e7 with the aim to castle, well, this you can forget. This king on e8 has moved several times and is not allowed to castle. He has lost his castling rights as early as move 2. If this picture were to appear as you see it here, can you suggest a way forward? As a hint, can you afford to surrender something, and if so, what are we looking at? It's this hit on the 7th. Should the knight vanish, can you fill in the gaps? It's this check using the queen. King g8 runs into this, takes on e6 using the knight, and everything breaks wide open. Knight d7 is a hole in the water. Use the knight to find this outpost, and because of the discovered check, this combo would have to run into a checkmate. King f8 leads to this sort of ending, and it's another checkmate. The only way to stop this mate is when this knight is offered on f7, instead of having him removed. What if you were to apply this kind of pin? Knight e5 can easily happen, but what if you approach this game using this queen move into h5? Should you get rid of the knight, just go on to eliminate this pawn with the knight, and should you go for this push to the 5th with ideas of attacking the knight? This one too is not going to be strong enough. First take with a check and Fischer would fall apart. King d8 can easily get this rook out of his misery, but before you consider this course of action, what if first you applied this check? Bishop d7 to block, and now queen takes rook, and there is nothing left to play for. All you have is this queen challenge to get the queens to come off, but what if you do not accept? What if you apply this check, and when the king runs for his life, just go on and take this bishop with a follow-up check? Takes, takes, and takes is going to run into this check, and with the king now finding the back rank, what if you apply this pin? Bishop f6, and now this rook lift to the 6th, and again Fischer is most likely to run into a one-way alley. There is no need to move this variation any further than this point. It can all start from this point with the knight jumping into the fifth. Nigel wanted to hold onto this pawn on e3 and rushed the queen in place to save him. We know Fischer was not a person who missed openings on the board, but how far would this bishop attack on the queen get him? Bishop c4 would have led to this knight to be developed, and should the bishops depart, this game would for sure look more or less equal. I'm not convinced it is, but at least this is a major improvement from how Fischer chose to start the game up. However, when it came to this position, Fischer bypassed the attack on the queen. He instead opted for this knight development. Nigel rushes the queen into place to challenge Fischer's queen. And with Fischer accepting the challenge, what Fischer gets out of this combo was this pawn in the center of the board. With him coming off, this bishop on g3 was lined up next. Nigel is short on time but is fully aware his bishop on g3 is covered by the knight. But because bishop a6 would aggravate things, he chose for this line of play. Do you take this bishop and hand over the knight, or do you opt for something else? Many people believe a bishop is stronger than a knight, but do not forget, a bishop is worth 3 points and a knight is worth as much. Under certain circumstances, the bishop is stronger, and under other circumstances, it's the knight that is stronger. When the board is open, bishops tend to be stronger, but when the position is closed and crumbed, the knight are way more flexible than anything else. We mentioned the likely effects of a bishop move into a6 just a second ago. This is exactly how Bobby Fischer proceeded. With Nigel forced to cover in this way, the knight was instantly removed, and with Nigel capturing, Fischer finds the opportune moment to chase after the bishop. Bishop c7 led to this bishop to come under fire again, and with Nigel short backing him off to this outpost, Bobby Fischer uses a third consecutive response to pursue the bishop. This is how he plays it. With the bishop backing off, you can immediately work out how bad this bishop on g3 is positioned. He is basically offside unless Fischer decides to trade the knight for him. And this is why many people believe it was not Fischer who was playing today, because this is how he played it. He went on to trade his relatively strong knight to the bishop, but it appears with the limited pieces Fischer has developed, just observe the structure of his pawns and how they occupy the chessboard. With this bishop now coming under fire, Nigel repositions him to this outpost and now via this knight making his way into the center of the board. One thing we can certainly rule out is that any computers were used. No computer at the time would come up with the moves we saw, but leaving this aside, let us follow this one all the way to the end. Can this pawn on g3 be saved? King h3 is most likely going to get this knight to make a U-turn, but what if we follow this one through via this bishop response? Or better not. Let's stick to the knight backing off. Knight h4 looks like a very interesting move but is not bound to get you anywhere. h5 for example, c3, takes and takes, is going to allow Fischer to take charge of this file, and not only Nigel has a pawn deficit, but these two pawns on g2 and g3 are not going to help the cause. Returning to the game, and this is where we deviated, Nigel jumped the gun. He actually jumped the knight, to be frank. He got him to reach the fourth, and what this move did was to allow Fischer to grab hold of this pawn from g3. Did he though? He did. With the rook automatically being attacked, Nigel backs him off to safety. And with now this pawn making his way into h5, Fischer is challenging Nigel short to chase after the rook. This is why this knight came into h4 in the first place, but Nigel is looking to use the knight when the time is right. This move to h5 by Fischer was spot on. It allows the corner rook some leeway, but at best play, Nigel can be looking at a repetition. As soon as this bishop was repositioned to this outpost on d3, you can instantly hear those alarm bells. When Fischer saw this move appear, the bishop came under fire. Nigel short now returns the bishop to where he stood earlier, and actually what he does is to trap this knight on g3. If you attack this knight with the king from either direction, this knight is most likely to drop like a fly. With Bobby Fischer to move, he too responded accordingly. What on earth did he do, and what does he play in the end? This is the move he decided to go for. It looks like nothing, but there is more than meets the eye here. We looked at the possibility of trapping this knight with a possible king attack with either king h2 or king f2. However, neither approach is bound to work. If king h2, this is what you would expect, and should you mount the pressure on this bishop, this is the likely answer to this worry. Let's return to where we left things. Right after Fischer lifted the rook to the 6th, Nigel short lined up his rook on this file, but as soon as he got confronted by this attack, not only this knight on h4 is a goner, but this was the point where Nigel short pressed the resigned button. This was his first ever encounter with the legendary Bobby Fischer, or if you do not believe it was Fischer, the Fischer imposter. It doesn't really matter if it was Bobby Fischer or not, because this was one game like you never seen before. Nigel short went for everything possible, and even his very best was not strong enough to beat whoever his opponent was. It was nothing like Bobby Fischer, but with Bobby Fischer being away from the limelight for so long, if this was Fischer, he knew exactly what to do. With each and every successive move right after move 5, he made things happen. He first pushed along with his pawns, he occupied key fields, and it wasn't until the endgame was basically reached, when he activated his rook to h6. Other than his first king and queen move to c7, and then to b6, there was a knight move to f6, and of course we saw a knight being developed into d7. After that, the queens were swapped, and when more pieces were traded. Knight c5, bishop c4, and knight e4, led to the game we saw being developed. What was particularly interesting was how Fischer's knight on g3, which looked completely hopeless, came to be the most important piece or minor piece from the entire lot. How on earth did Fischer manage this win with how he started was certainly a big surprise to both Nigel short and everyone else who later watched it on the internet. Mind you, game 1 was relatively tame when compared to the games that followed, but we had to start from somewhere. Like we said before, Fischer or not, these 8 games were absolutely fantastic to experience. Not only we saw the rise of the Bongcloud opening, but there are tons to learn. Not too long ago, Hikaru Nakamura tried a Bongcloud opening on Wesley, so we then saw Magnus Carlsen try this against Hikaru Nakamura himself, and of course we saw the same type of openings going mad with the king across the board. If it wasn't Bobby Fischer making a third coming, who on earth was Nigel short playing? Given some ridiculous moves were rolled out, we can rule out the use of a computer, because the most powerful computers at the time played nothing like this. What about the possibility someone not being Bobby Fischer was using a computer to get help? Like we said earlier, given this was a blitz encounter, you simply do not have the time to use a computer. Your ideas and thoughts would much be appreciated at this stage. If you like to see more games featuring Nigel Short and Bobby Fischer, you know what to do. In the meantime, I sincerely hope you have enjoyed today's game, and until next time, God bless and thank you for watching.